done a business before, and I made all the classic mistakes of not really concentrating on cash flow. I'd take on too many projects at once and hired a bunch of people, and I ended up overextending and ended up with a ton of credit card debt. Compared myself to other people my age who had stable jobs, and I really envied them. Looking back now, it was all worth it. The struggle was painful for many years, even though it seemed like I was, I guess, behind my peers for a long time. I've sort of caught up through that entrepreneurial leap there. Also have autism, and the crossover between autism and ADHD, I think, disguised some of the effects at a young age. When I was a child, there was less awareness of both ADHD and autism. The stereotype of ADHD was someone who was very disruptive in class, a boy who would show more of the hyperactive signs. I'm a great ideas guy, and I'm really good at starting things. I've recognized that I'm not so great at following through. Fired from my first 6 jobs, and that's quite typical for people with autism and ADHD.
One of the interesting thoughts that just came into my mind right now was there's relationships, there's partners out there that are struggling with a partner that has ADHD.
Some of the recommendations in terms of helps people with ADHD and autism, according to some research, are
what was first crazy to me was that you live like on the complete opposite side of the world from me. I think I was talking to one of your managers or your assistants, and we were confused a little bit on the emails because I think on your end it's already Friday, right? And the time of this recording, it's still Thursday on our end. Like, it's really crazy for me. So I'm like, you're 18 hours ahead. I like think about it like you're in the future right now, which is crazy. But that's awesome. And I just thank you for taking the time of just coming on here and, being able to share your story, being able to have this conversation with me. The first question that I always like to ask just to get things going is, for the people who don't know you and for the people who don't know what you do, give me a little bit of context on what is it that you do, the person that you are, what got you to where you're at right now. Just give me a little bit of background story about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of where I am now, I'm someone who likes to spin a lot of plates. I've got ADHD, and as a result, I've got a day job, I've got 2 side businesses, and a lot of hobbies. And that's something that I've always done, and in some ways, it has helped me and hindered me. From when I graduated university, at that time, I had a part-time job, and then I started freelancing, and that really led on to the business and the career that I've had. That I worked as a software developer for some time, and part of that was initially me working as a freelancer. So I was specializing in the Zoho suite. Zoho is a collection of applications like Zoho CRM, Zoho Books, a bunch of different apps that small businesses use to run their operations. And when I first started working with it 12 years ago, it was quite unknown at that point. It was very clunky and ugly, but it did an important job. It was very useful for small businesses that wanted to get something up and running very quickly, and they didn't want to spend too much on it. Over time, it's really evolved, and now it's a major contender in the CRM space. I sort of rode that wave. I was an early Zoho influencer, where I had done a bunch of YouTube videos explaining how to do certain things within the Zoho suite, and I did a bunch of blog posts as well. And that meant that I was seen as someone who had some credibility in the Zoho space, which was finding clients for my freelancing and consulting business. But also later on, when I started making integrations with other products, I did a round robin integration, which helps companies to assign leads to different salespeople depending on the time of day and the type of lead. And then later I did a SMS integration. And those apps, they ended up doing quite well, I believe, mainly because I had a slight audience. I'm not talking about a PewDiePie style audience on YouTube. I had 1,800 subscribers, which sounds insignificant, but was actually quite instrumental in creating trust. That there were 1,800 people who actually knew Zoho intimately, and they're out there. I got some pretty good response, that people were willing to give my apps a go because they trusted me from what I had been putting out there previously. And that ultimately led to the SMS integration building up some steam, becoming a serious business in its own right. And then that business ended up being acquired in February 2022. And now that's my day job, continuing to work on that as a product manager. It's like from the outset a smooth ride, but it was very bumpy. We were talking earlier about some of the challenges that might be behind the scenes. And really in those early years of running that consulting business, it was a very rocky road for me because I'd never done a business before, and I made all the classic mistakes of not really concentrating on cash flow. I'd take on too many projects at once and hired a bunch of people, and I ended up overextending and ended up with a ton of credit card debt, 50 grand in credit card debt, which was a huge amount for me at that time when my income was very low. So I was really, at that time in my early 20s, very anxious and very worried about what was going to happen. So I couldn't see a way out of that. And I was, I guess, as partly a result of that, or just accompanying it, I also had an eating disorder. So I was really struggling mental health wise in my early 20s and wasn't really sure how I was going to actually find a way forward. I compared myself to other people my age who had stable jobs, and I really envied them. Looking back now, it was all worth it. The struggle was painful for many years, but the process of selling the business has meant that even though it seemed like I was, I guess, behind my peers for a long time, I've sort of caught up through that entrepreneurial leap there, but very, very difficult time. And I don't necessarily recommend entrepreneurship for people who don't have a tough stomach for those type of experiences.
I 100% agree. And so what really caught my attention was it isn't easy. And especially with dealing with like you mentioned right now, like mental health issues, the eating disorder, having ADHD at a young age, and still kind of battling through it. What was, I guess, the reason why you wanted to pursue business? And you mentioned a lot of the times like the hardships and the bumps that you were faced along the way. What were those bumps? What were some of the hardships that took a lot for you to get over? Like a lot of the times it's like it takes, sink or swim type of mindset to just get through something, right? Was there ever a moment like that for you? What were those bumps for you? Why did you get into entrepreneurship and business?
In terms of why I got into entrepreneurship, it was partly because I thought it was fun and exciting, and also partly because I wasn't having much luck actually finding a regular job. I graduated in 2008, which was a very turbulent time in the global economy. We were having the global financial crisis, and my university specialization in environmental science was at the time not very well regarded in Australia, where we were really prioritizing mining coal as one of the hallmarks of the economy. And there weren't many jobs going for someone who wanted to do something a bit differently. So I was almost in some ways forced into entrepreneurship because I couldn't find a regular job. And I found that what I liked about it was, especially with freelancing and then running a small agency, was the freedom that I had, that I could work from home and set my own hours, and necessarily just work from home either. I worked from Bali for a while and really enjoyed that freedom and enjoyed being able to do things my way. I had a job during university in a large company and felt very hamstrung by the bureaucracy of that, and annoyed by the fact that I'd have these ideas about how to improve processes and they'd just go into a black hole and end up not being actioned. Whereas with my own business, I had the freedom and the power to enact those ideas that I had. The bumps along the way were what I mentioned earlier around growing too quickly, that with the consulting business that I had a lot of people asking me to do work. And part of my ADHD tendencies is I can be quite impulsive and not really think things through. So I just say yes to all these projects, not really factoring in that I could probably handle maybe 3 of them on my own. But now I had 15 running at once, and I didn't have a team that I could rely on. I had a few people who seemed to cope okay with the few projects that I'd given them. But as I piled more work on, they sort of crumbled under the load, as did I. And we were going through a stage where I was working 70-hour weeks, and it wasn't enough. And then compounding that, we had clients go into liquidation. So we'd do all this work and then didn't get paid for it, because partly there were some clients where they didn't pay us because we did our job, which is fair enough. And then other clients where we did a job that they weren't able to pay because they just had other macroeconomic factors impacting them. So it reached the point where I just couldn't continue, that every project that I'd take on, I was to expose me to further cash flow risk, that I did get paid a little bit from the upfront deposit, but it wasn't going to be enough to actually address the ongoing burn rate that I was maintaining with the team. So it's a bit like in the E-Myth, he talks about how it's very common for someone to do this, that they're a skilled technician and then they branch out on their own and they try and hire people to help, and they don't really put enough systems in place, and it ends up all collapsing under its own weight. That's very much what happened to me. And I went back to admitting defeat and getting a regular job, which was a bit more feasible because the economic situation was better, and all the skills that I had learned from running a business allowed me to then get a regular job. So it wasn't lost, and I didn't completely give it up. I continued doing the business part-time and with clients that I knew I could do a good job with, but it felt very distressing at points, both seeing the crippling burden of the debt and also just feeling bad about not having done a good job for the clients. When it was just me, I did an exceptional job, but when it was me and a team that I hadn't sufficiently trained, it didn't end up being a good result.
You mentioned something very interesting in the beginning, was when a lot of people think that going into entrepreneurship is like the better route in life, right? Like you said, like you're going to have a lot more freedom, you're going to have a lot more finances and money, but there's a lot of risk involved in that. Was there ever, you mentioned that you went like $50,000 in debt, which is pretty normal when you go into entrepreneurship, but it's also a very scary and lucrative thing to get yourself into, right? But that's one of the risks and one of the sacrifices that you have to take. Was there ever one of those moments that you mentioned where you didn't know how you were going to get through? And kind of walk me through that story. What was one of those stories where you faced something, you hit the wall, and you were like, I don't know how I'm going to do this. Should I be doing this? And how did you overcome that?
It was every week, essentially. Every week, I'm wondering, how am I going to pay the team? How am I going to pay my rent? I can't see how the numbers are going to align. And for a while, there were miracles that came up where I'd just be about to run out of cash, and then a new client would show up and we'd be able to sign them and get the upfront deposit to keep the business going for a bit longer. So I continued to have these glimmers of hope, but it reached the point where that wasn't happening anymore, and I was just ending up further in debt. And I was at the point where I was really stressed. I was having to borrow money from my parents just to pay for food and rent, and I realized I needed to make a change. So the way that I see it now is that the safer way to do entrepreneurship is what I did after that experience, where I went and got a job and I continued to do part-time entrepreneurship for a while. There's someone that I really respect in the entrepreneurship community, Rob Walling, who runs the MicroConf conference, and he talks about this philosophy of stair-stepping, which is antithetical to the look before you leap mentality. Instead, you recognize that you do have financial obligations, and it's really suitable for people who have families and mortgages to pay. Instead of jumping straight into it, you do the business part-time. You do it initially in your off hours, after work and on weekends. And then as you start getting more income and more predictable income, you can then go down to part-time. And then eventually, as it becomes more and more stable and able to support you, you can go full-time on it. And that's the journey that I undertook subsequently. I worked in a job for a couple of years, full-time, paid off the credit card debt. And I was still maintaining the Zoho consulting business on the side as something that I did in the mornings, because the the good thing about the time zone difference is that I can, at certain times of the year, it's pretty good. Like right now, I can wake up at, say, 5 a.m. and it's at that point 1 p.m. in New York. At later times in the year, it's not as good at 5 a.m. It's 3 p.m. in New York. But there's windows where it's possible to have decent overlap with US-based clients, and that tended to be where the majority of the Zoho clients were. So I picked up a fair bit of consulting work where I was just doing it, either meeting clients in the morning and then doing the work in the evening. And that was something that kept it going and meant that I continued to have knowledge of the Zoho community, and I continued to do things like I not only did the YouTube videos, but I built a Udemy course and I wrote a book. And I continued to have some credibility as a Zoho expert, which allowed me later to launch the software products, because that was, I guess, a reaction to the difficulties that I'd had with building a team, that I started to have less faith in other people and more faith in technology. So that's the way that I'm very interested in business these days, that instead of doing a service-based business, and I mean, I still do that, but it's more of a way of actually getting people to pay for SaaS products. Because I found that with the various integrations I've done for Zoho, it's a lot easier for me to build one thing and sell it to 500 businesses compared to even having 15 clients is pretty hard, because they all have different bespoke requirements. It's hard to keep that going. So that's the direction I ended up going down, the stair-stepping approach of having a job and then progressively going down to 4 days and then 3 days and then 2 days in the day job, and building up the business on the side and being able to move more towards the business as the revenue increases.
One of the interesting subjects that I really want to touch is the ADHD and like the different ways that you can manage that. Before I touch on that subject, though, I have a story that I kind of want you to, that's going to lead into this whole conversation. And it's, how did you grow up? How was your childhood like? How was your childhood like growing up with ADHD? How did your parents view it? And especially running. And I think the most important part is like being able to run businesses while having ADHD. How did you manage all that? I think that's really important. I had a phone call before this with one of my best friends, and she's currently going through that, where her partner is struggling with ADHD. He's medicated for it. And so she lined up a bunch of different questions that she wanted me to kind of ask. But I think the most important part is like, how did you cope with running a business with ADHD? How did you grow up with it as a child? How was your childhood like? And then your parents' perspective on it.
I actually got diagnosed with ADHD late in life. I also have autism, and the crossover between autism and ADHD, I think, disguised some of the effects at a young age. So I was always very academically talented, a couple of years ahead of my peers academically, and generally a couple of years behind socially. These days it would get picked up and I probably would have had early intervention, but when I was a child, there was less awareness of both ADHD and autism. The stereotype of ADHD was someone who was very disruptive in class, a boy who would show more of the hyperactive signs, whereas I was always a very nervous and anxious kid, so I wouldn't do anything to get the teacher's attention on me. I'd just be, I guess, focusing on doing the schoolwork really quickly and then going and playing video games. It became a bit more evident as I got older. I think one of the hallmarks for me is the executive dysfunction that accompanies both ADHD and autism. I used to live 5 minutes away from my high school, which you'd think would make it very easy for me to get there on time, but I think probably at least 50% of the school days I would rock up late. And that's very emblematic of the way that I lived my life, that I was very last minute. I'd get into what's called hyperfocus, where I'd find something that I was doing that really interested me. In my teenage years, it was video games. I'd just be playing RuneScape until late at night and the first thing in the morning as well. And I'd forget that actually I need to brush my teeth before I leave for school. And so I'd always be running late and I'd lose things and I'd be pretty disorganized with my assignments. I was lucky that when I did actually do my schoolwork, I was able to power through it really quickly, because otherwise I would have really struggled academically. But it was something that got increasingly challenging for me as I moved out of home and as I had to do more things on my own. The general adult life skills felt a bit mysterious to me. And that's probably part of what contributed to the challenges with running a business as well, that I wasn't very good at actually looking at my financial records and planning ahead. The impulsivity would often come out. What it has helped longer term is recognizing that I'm a great ideas guy and I'm really good at starting things. I've recognized that I'm not so great at following through. As an antidote to that, I've realized that I can't do businesses on my own. I need to have a team with me. So I've always, even at the time where I downsized and I let go of the larger team, I still kept a few people to work with, because I found that experience of having someone to bounce ideas off and being able to delegate to someone, even if they actually weren't very good at it, just the process of delegating to someone is similar to body doubling, which is a very popular technique in the ADHD community, where if you do something with another person, it mysteriously feels easier and it's easier to actually get started on a task. So I think I was secretly, without realizing it, dealing with my ADHD symptoms through techniques like body doubling. And I was obsessed with productivity techniques as well from when I was about 17. Productivity was one of my, autistic special interests. That tends to be a trait there, where autistic people find something that they immerse themselves in. And for me, that was reading Getting Things Done by David Allen and all these different productivity books, because I recognized that without having these hugely elaborate systems for remembering things and prioritizing my work, I was just a mess. So it was a combination of me scaffolding some executive functioning and having a team around me that allowed me to actually have some semblance of functioning in my business.
I struggle with this a little bit, and I kind of want to get your input on it. Is, for example, like right now I have like 5 or 6 different desktops. I have millions of tabs open, and it's like, how would you advise somebody to be able to manage that? I think I have some type of form of ADHD as well, where I'm just like, I start a lot of tasks. Sometimes I don't even start going through them. Sometimes I just leave them there. Sometimes it's also hard building a team. There's individuals out there who probably don't even have a team or can't really afford to get a team to be able to take care of these tasks, right? But like you said earlier, like there's a lot of ideas and there's a lot of things that you want to get into and you want to manage and you want to do. What are some of the things that I guess you can give some advice or some tips on for anybody who struggles with having this organization, with having so many things open, and how can they start delegating to get these tasks completed?
Yeah, a great question. The a million tabs open was very common for me. I guess a band-aid solution to that is having a tab limiter. So I have my computer set up such that I can't have more than 5 tabs open at once, because I find if I don't do that, then I end up cycling through windows and seeing, I haven't finished filling out this form here. And then I remember as I opened that form that the reason I hadn't finished filling it out was because I needed to gather some more information. So I swap to a different tab and then I get distracted halfway through that. And the result is that there's a lot of things going on, but very few things being driven to completion. So just having the work in progress limit with the tab limiter is very helpful for me. And the overall philosophy of Kanban, where you try and limit the number of things that you're doing at any one time, I find that very painful, but very important to me. So I now operate with a piece of paper in front of me at all times, so that if I have an idea of, I need to go and talk to so-and-so, I just write it down, because in the past I'd immediately go and start a new email thread with that person, and that leads to further distraction. So that's part of it, just having a work in progress limit in terms of both the number of tabs and the number of projects. And then in terms of the difficulty of finding a team, I've found that the cost isn't necessarily prohibitive, especially now with AI tools. But even before ChatGPT and all of that existed, people in the Philippines are, for me, they're in a very convenient time zone, and I can pay someone well in the Philippines without it being burdensome from a cash flow perspective. So I'd invite people to try and be creative there, and maybe look at people who might want to be co-founders if they can't afford to pay someone, because it does make a huge difference. And there's also, even if the person isn't actually working on the same thing, body doubling can still come into play. There's a website called FocusMate and Cave Day. There's a few like that if you Google body doubling, where you can find someone who's available at the same time, and you do a session together where you get on a call and you spend a couple of minutes up front saying, for the next hour, I'm going to work on this. And the other person will say, well, I'm going to work on this. And you don't have to help each other with it, but just having the accountability that you've told someone verbally that this is what I'm going to do. And then you check in at the end of the session, this is what I did. And that accountability is hugely powerful. I sometimes also do YouTube videos for that reason. I'll record myself doing the work as a form of accountability. That's why I had so many videos on YouTube. A lot of it was me just trying to actually convince myself to do the work. And I found if I recorded myself doing it, then it made it more fun. So if you can do things like that, that can really help. But there's a ton of ADHD productivity tactics that you'll find if you look online. You could even look on TikTok. There's a bunch of ADHD influencers there that have ADHD hacks.
Real quick, I want to cut into the conversation and say thank you to everybody listening right now, to listening to the conversations that we have with our guests, to following the podcast and being engaged with the podcast. I can't tell you how much that means the world to me and the team, for you to give an hour of your day to listen to these stories, to follow the podcast, to listen to these conversations. You can be doing anything else with that 1 hour, but for some reason you chose to come here and listen to these conversations. So I'm very grateful. And thank you. Some of the few that I always try is like, whenever I know that I have to get something done, sometimes I'm very bad at it too. Sometimes I'll wait till like the day of in order to get something done before a meeting or something like that, which, nobody should ever do. But one of the things that I always try, like, as far as like my tactics, is like throw my phone in the bed, or like throw my phone in another room and then just never go to it or forget that it's there, and then it's like that little thing is like, oh, you get lazy to start getting up from your chair and going to the other room and getting your phone and coming back. So it's like, you don't even bother. It's one of the tactics that's like, I usually, sometimes what I'll do is like, I'll just like time myself. I'll like put a timer on my phone and be like, okay, I got to get this done, and I got to keep myself accountable to get this done in 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. And then that timer is kind of like my ticking time bomb, right? Of like saying like, hey, time's almost up and I'm barely here. I got to get it done. And maybe I shouldn't be scrolling on TikTok. Maybe I shouldn't be doing, whatever else that's distracting me, right? Which is why I really like the whole program that you built on the Focus Bear. Because as I was looking into that, it's like it keeps you just locked into one thing. I've seen things on TikTok where it's like you buy a product where you like lock your phone inside of it and it has like a little timer and you can't get your phone out of that until the timer runs out. So it's like being able to put restrictions on yourself, I think, is probably one of the actionable steps that you can do. It's just taking accountability and then getting those actionable steps, right, to lead up to those accountability steps. One of the key things that my friend kind of was mentioning earlier was that she deals with the lack of support of getting people with people who are getting diagnosed with ADHD or that might have it, getting the right help for it, right? Sometimes people don't take ADHD as a serious matter. Sometimes people don't understand it, and so they wouldn't care about it, right? For somebody who's experiencing ADHD and needs assistance with it, sometimes people don't take them serious. Was that ever a scenario that maybe you faced or somebody that has faced? What were some of the steps that they were able to take to go and seek that help or get somebody to kind of take that type of situation serious?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. I think awareness of neurodivergence and neurodiversity is increasing. In Australia, there's a lot of employers now that almost try and hire people who are neurodivergent because they know that there's a lot of strengths that go along with it, not just the weaknesses, and they set up accommodations or adjustments to the workplace to make it easier. So I'd suggest that that's essentially one thing that people could do. Find a employer that has some kind of stated position on embracing neurodiversity, because it's going to be much easier if they actually are taking steps already to look after their neurodivergent staff rather than you having to educate them. Some of the recommendations in terms of helps people with ADHD and autism, according to some research, are that one of the biggest adjustments is working from home. Being able to control the environment is often challenging in the office. One of the biggest things for me is often background noise, that if people are having conversations around me, it's very difficult for me to concentrate. And that's part of why I think I struggled in that corporate job that I had, and even some of the later jobs that I had. And I found that during COVID, it was amazing for me because I didn't have to have some kind of exception for working from home. I just started working from home and I haven't stopped. I'm still only going into the office very occasionally. That's a huge win for me, and for most people that makes a big difference. Being able to control the sound around you, being able to control the lights, and being able to also have a lot more flexibility in taking breaks. There's research from the Neurodiversity at Work report, which is a UK-based research report, and they found changing the workplace environment, being able to take frequent breaks, adjusting the schedules, and adjusting policies is some of the key adjustments that can take place. So I'd recommend that if people are struggling with their employer not understanding their neurodivergence and needing some backing in order to get those adjustments, really go to check out the Neurodiversity at Work report. It's published by a group called Neurodiversity in Business. Happy to provide a link and we can include it in the show notes. That can be passed on to the employer's HR department. And there's also, in the US, there is, I think it's the JAN, the Job Assistance Network, which has a list of common adjustments that employers will provide their staff. And most of them cost nothing and are beneficial to everyone, that most people benefit from not having background conversations around them. Most people benefit from schedule flexibility. So we can advocate in that respect that it's not some kind of weird thing that only neurodivergent people need. We can advocate it as being a best practice, a universal design principle that will help everyone.
One of the most interesting, I think, thoughts that came into my head was how do you show early signs, or how do you notice signs of somebody with ADHD? And it could be from like a newborn child. How do you realize that maybe your newborn has ADHD or is developing ADHD? What are some signs of that? Maybe some of the characteristics that people should probably be aware of when it comes to realizing that it's something that is there with their child or with anybody that they're related with, that can help them catch it early on and being able to kind of run it out.
I'm not a pediatrician, so it's a bit hard for me to answer this authoritatively, but I think it's probably not necessarily that easy to pick up until the child is a little bit older and you can see how they're developing compared to other children their age. One of my colleagues has a child who's been diagnosed with ADHD, and it was around the 5-year mark where it became evident compared to other kids at his childcare. He was really struggling with sensory issues, and he'd be, running quite hyperactive, unable to sit still. Some of that is typical toddler behavior. So that's why you sort of need to benchmark it against other kids. And I think that the part that might be helpful to people is thinking about what does it look like for adults? Because if you're my age, and especially if you're a woman, the chances are that it wouldn't have been picked up when you were younger. Because for women, ADHD manifests differently compared to men. That there tend to be fewer of the overt hyperactivity signs, because there's a really strong social expectation for girls in particular that if they are hyperactive, they almost get shunned socially. So they tend to not express those kind of symptoms in a way that would be more evident for boys. But some of there are assessments online. I think it's important to actually get it assessed by a medical professional. But there's two overall strains of ADHD. There's the inattentive type, where you find it hard to stay concentrating on one task at a time. And maybe you're like me, and when you're in a work meeting, if it gets slightly boring, maybe you open your email and start multitasking. For me, that was one of the major signs and one of the major problems. That's a sign of inattention. And then the hyperactivity side of it, it can be some of the questions that are in the assessment are you constantly moving like you're driven by a motor? Do you find it hard to sit still? And that might not be necessarily a literal thing. It might be that it's a bit like the way that I behaved, where I was unable to sit still in the sense of unable to stick with one job. I always had at least 2 jobs going at the same time. And I'd basically do that because otherwise I found one job boring. So to encourage people, if you feel like there might be a problem with it, you can begin with self-diagnosis online, and you don't necessarily need to seek a formal diagnosis. You can start dealing with some of the symptoms immediately. Some of the ways that don't involve medication are just making adjustments like the ones that I spoke about earlier in terms of adjustments to your workplace. And there are very specific things that I think work remarkably well. I talked about body doubling, which is one really powerful thing where you could do it with a friend, you could do it with a colleague, book a meeting with them when there's something hard to do and do it together. And another thing that I've found has really helped my own symptoms is using bouts of exercise to help improve my focus. I was always a keen runner from a kid, and I think that was almost how I controlled some of my hyperactivity symptoms. I just go for a run. It helped me to relax. It helped me to be able to concentrate. And these days what I do is I go for a run first thing in the morning, or a bike ride, some form of cardio exercise where I'm moving, sometimes roller skiing as well. And then throughout the day, I've actually got this under-desk elliptical trainer. And if I'm in a meeting where I'm not very involved, like right now I'm not using it because I'm talking and I'm in the zone, I'm concentrating. But if I'm in a meeting with 10 people and my involvement is very limited and I'm just there to soak up information, that's the times where I tended to tune out and start doing other work. And now what I do is I move my chair a little bit closer and I can start pedaling on my elliptical trainer. And that really helps me to actually be able to focus on what the other people are saying, because I'm doing something to occupy my body, and it seems to free up my mind in order to be able to concentrate. So you can find little hacks like that might help you, even if you don't necessarily have clinical level of ADHD. There's a spectrum, I guess, just like with autism, ADHD is being recognized as a spectrum too, that the spectrums of severity, and you probably, if you reach the age of 30, I'm 35, without being formally diagnosed, you probably developed some coping mechanisms of your own, and you can stack further coping mechanisms on top of that to deal with the ADHD symptoms without them becoming debilitating.
Interestingly, I want to get your thought on this certain subject. So usually when I think what I've always been feeling is I think the world is moving too fast for ourselves, and maybe that's what makes us anxious or develop some form of ADHD within us. Is like, for example, like when you scroll on TikTok, right? We're now being adjusted to like pay attention to short-term content, right? And it's like we're always saying short-term content, that it's like even as kids, you give your kid an iPad and they're looking at like TikTok and just very short-term things that like are quick and fast, right? Do you think that's an issue for the world that we're living in, where we're lacking the thought of learning how to be patient or learning how to look at things for a longer period of time, because we're living now and we're being forced to look at short-term things, and the world is moving at a fast pace, that we're lacking that patience and we're lacking just slowing down? Maybe that's what's causing it.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of commentators who speculate that ADHD may actually be partially caused by screen time usage. there is some research to support that, though there's also distinct symptoms. So it's definitely, if not an explanation at all times, it's certainly a contributing factor that when I consume short form content, it definitely seems to exacerbate my impulsivity and my inattention symptoms. It's something that I have sworn off personally, that I do not use TikTok, and I'm actually on a social media fast where for the last 3 months I haven't used Facebook or Twitter or any Reddit or any of those social networks, because I find it really does mess with my brain, and it makes it hard for me to consume the longer form content that I actually find nourishing. Even things like being able to go to a conference and listen to people give a talk for half an hour. That was very hard for me in the past. I'd be on Twitter as I was listening to the conference, telling myself that this is how I engage with it, that I'm having conversations with other attendees. But really, it was just a difficulty in me sitting still and listening. And that's something that I have been training myself. There's sort of metacognitive strategies as well as the medication option. Those things help to be able to, I guess, reset the brain to go back to what we were probably, I guess, evolutionary wired for, which is probably not TikTok. I think TikTok probably activates there's a lion or there's some tasty food senses, and that's not healthy for us to be doing all the time. Mindfulness is another antidote for it, and it's something that I really struggled with for a long time, that I knew that people were saying meditation is great for you, but I found it hard to actually sit still. And something that I'm now getting back into through the tiny habits approach. I think you sort of touched on that earlier in terms of with your phone, throwing it into another room or on your bed. That's a great example where the book talks about, to make a bad habit less problematic, you create more friction for yourself so that it's hard to do it. And the opposite applies for a habit that you want to cultivate. You want to make it really low friction. You want to make it easy to meditate. You want to make it attractive and satisfying. And for me, the way I did that is by starting with a very small amount of meditation, 5 minutes per day, and gradually building it up by 1 minute per week as my tolerance for it developed. And I've really seen improvements throughout the rest of my day from doing those now 18 minutes in the morning, and then also trying to have as many moments of mindfulness as I can throughout the day. I've had a history in the past of constantly being plugged in, constantly having headphones in, constantly listening to audiobooks or podcasts. And you should listen to this podcast because this is a great podcast, but at an appropriate time. I used to be listening to podcasts while I was writing code and while I was doing things that shouldn't actually be accompanied by listening to someone in my ears. I think there are some things where it's pretty mindless and you can get away with it, but there's also something to be said for just, for example, washing the dishes and doing nothing else. I've been finding that adopting that habit of not listening to things at all times has meant that I get more ideas, that while I'm washing the dishes, I'm having an inspiration about how to improve my business. And I keep a notepad nearby to write those ideas down. So I guess going back to your question, I think screen time and the short form content is problematic, but we can fight back against it by adopting a mindset that that's not the way that we want to operate, that we do want to reserve time for contemplation and consuming books and work that requires deep thought and concentration, and potentially enlisting help in that by using distraction blockers. That's sort of why I created Focus Bear, to prevent me from going down those rabbit holes.
Going back full circle, in the beginning, you mentioned that you had an audience that believed in your project, believed in your vision, and they were following you because they really resonated with the things that you were doing. Mentioning Focus Bear right now, what is the legacy that you hope to leave down within the next 10, 20, 30 years? Even after, it's like, what do you plan your legacy to be? What is your mission and your goal to achieve with what you're doing right now, and especially with Focus Bear?
I'm really passionate about reducing the barriers to employment for people who are neurodivergent. I didn't mention as well that part of the reason that I sought entrepreneurship was because I think I mentioned that I found it hard to get a job, but actually to compound that, I did get a few jobs and I got fired from them. I got fired from my first 6 jobs, and that's quite typical for people with autism and ADHD. The rates of unemployment amongst autistic people are 4 times higher than for neurotypical people, which is a real tragedy because they have so much to offer. The same thing for people with ADHD, that unemployment rates and early termination are a lot worse than for neurotypical people. I really want to see that change. I want to see a world where neurodivergent people can bring their strengths to work, because we do have so many. Our ability to hyperfocus, our creativity, our different ways of seeing the world mean that we are an important part of any organization. And I want to help neurodivergent people through the tools and the content that I'm creating. So with Focus Bear, we've got the distraction blocker product, but we're also doing things around executive functioning. I mentioned that I was always late for school as a kid, and that's one thing I'm working on at the moment through a feature we're calling Late No More, where it's like your typical calendar alarm, but it's a lot more in your face. So instead of just a visual pop-up, it actually starts talking to me if I'm about to run late at the time of the event. It progresses in the intensity of the alarm. So it'll be a gentle little ding at the beginning, but it turns into a crescendo of sound effects. For me, it plays, there's a song by Guttermouth called You're Late. Often I'm in another room because I've walked off to do something else. And when I hear that song play, I know I need to run back to my computer so I can get onto the meeting. There are a lot of other things that we want to do, helping people not just to be on time and to avoid distractions, but to be able to also avoid burnout, because that tends to be very common amongst neurodivergent people, that we end up working way too hard to compensate for the difficulties that we face. And then that has downsides to sleep and just ability to relax, which can lead to burnout. So all of those things are my target. I want to see a world where people can be productive, part of a community, and also have some play in their life.
I always love asking this question because I always feel like it brings out a very interesting perspective of the guest that we have, or a specific answer that it just gets you thinking. And the question is so simple: is what do you think about the most?
The Roman Empire, is that the correct answer? I thought you were going to ask me what the color blue is. No, what I think about the most is something that is almost a problem for me. I tend to think about my work a lot, and that has been problematic in the sense that with my relationship with my wife, she actually would like me to be thinking about her a bit in the evenings, and to be able to have dinner and to have a conversation about things that don't involve ADHD or neurodivergence or Zoho or SMS. So what I'm actually trying to consciously think about is, how do I create more play and relaxation in my life? How do I cultivate health, both in physical and mental health, so that there's a bit of more of a balance there, that I want to focus on my work during my work hours, and I want to focus on being a good husband, a good friend, a good member of a family, and hopefully soon a good father if we're lucky enough to have a kid.
I think one of the interesting thoughts that just came into my mind right now was, there's relationships, there's partners out there that are struggling with a partner that has ADHD, or that has difficulties being able to focus on something or put something into priority. What are some of the advice that you can give to that? Some of the things that they can do to be able to, I guess, not work together, but be able to set boundaries with one another in a relationship, when it comes down to these subjects of, being with your partner that may be diagnosed with ADHD, or with somebody that may be struggling with that type of scenarios.
Yeah, well, my wife is one of those people struggling with a partner who has ADHD. And it's something that has really colored my past relationships as well. I've never ended a relationship voluntarily, but my girlfriends broke up with me in the past because I wasn't really there for them, that I'd have a lot of interest and intensity in the relationship in the beginning, and then I'd get distracted by other things, and they felt neglected, and they felt that I wasn't showing up for them. So it's something that I'm having to be super intentional about being a good husband. I use Focus Bear. Basically, one of the main reasons for building the app was so my wife wouldn't divorce me. One of the things that I've had to set up is processes around, I need to cut off work at a reasonable time. Originally it was 7 p.m. and now I've brought it back, so it's more like 4:30 p.m. just so I can actually make time for doing things like helping cooking dinner, putting the bins out, doing some chores around the home, because otherwise I tend to be blind to it. I just go out and I focus on the things that I care about, and I don't see the mess around me. So that would be one of the things, brainstorming with the partner about how can we set up a system that is going to allow you to meet the non-ADHD partner's needs. And it shouldn't be prescriptive. I think what works best for me is if my wife says, hey, Jeremy, we're going on a holiday in a couple of weeks. I need you to pack your bags. How do you plan to approach that? She's got her way of doing it. I've got my way of doing it. I like to make a list. I like to put things into packing cells and do things in a certain way. It's not the way that she would do it. I stack dishes differently to the way that she does it. And I think part of it is not letting the ADHD make excuses, but also letting them do it in a way that they want to do it. Because that's one of the traits of ADHD, that we can be quite oppositional. We have our own ways of doing things. So if you are trying to force someone to do things in a certain way, that may not be ideal. But if you do make it clear, hey, honey, I do need you to make time for me. I do need you to rock up for this appointment that we have together tomorrow morning. How do you plan to achieve that? How can I support you with that? And let them come up with their own unique strategy, which may seem really wacky and weird to you, but is going to work for them.
One of my favorite things to always kind of put on an end note is, what is the term success? If you can define the term success and happiness in the dictionary, how would you define that in your own perspective?
For me, it would involve multidisciplinary success. So I think it's not necessarily easy, but possible to be highly successful in one domain of life whilst basically torching the remainder of your life. And that's probably what I did earlier in my career, where I really didn't do a good job looking after my health, didn't do a good job looking after my relationships. And I'm realizing that it's not possible to keep going long term the way that I was going, where I was working until 9 p.m. every night. So for me, success would have to imply that it's not one dimensional, that it's a bit like those charts that you can fill out, the life wheel, where you rate every area of your life, and success would be based on the average score rather than on the maximum score in one domain.
One of the ending questions that we have for the show is, I actually made it a two-parter on this one, is what is probably one of the untold stories that you have that you've maybe never shared before that you may feel comfortable sharing on here? Just an untold story that you feel can help somebody through something, especially when it comes to ADHD or being able to focus or being productive. And then the second question to that is a question that a guest leaves for the next guest, not knowing who the next guest is going to be. But I first kind of want you to answer that first one. It's just, what is something that's an untold story that you feel might be helpful to somebody?
One thing that springs to mind is, in terms of productivity, I held myself to a standard that I needed to work 8 hours per day. And I've realized that it's actually not possible for me to do that. That I am absolutely frazzled after 4 hours of deep work. And I'm now okay with that. I've recognized, looking at the jobs that I've had, that if I do 4 hours of hyper focus, I achieve more than my neurotypical peers. And that I found is very helpful in taking the stress off, that I need to take a lot of breaks in order to even achieve 4 hours. And if I do that, it's an amazing day. So that's what I'd like to share, that if you've got ADHD, you probably have superpowers of concentration, that you can work really quickly and get a lot done. But doing more than 4 hours per day of that type of deep work is pretty much impossible to do on a long-term basis. So reset your standards, benchmark where you are right now, and try and get to that point of doing an amount that is sustainable, that isn't going to burn you out. And the question, you want me to come up with a question that you might ask the next guest?
So our ending tradition, I guess, here is that there's our previous guest left a question for you, not knowing who the question is going to be left for. And so the question that they left for you was, if you go anywhere or do anything, what would you do, or where would you go and why?
I love cross-country skiing. So I would be, right now it's coming into summer, I would be probably going to Sweden, I reckon. I've always wanted to go to Sweden, do some cross-country skiing there, still keep on working, but combine basically skiing during the day and working on Focus Bear in the afternoons and the evenings.
If you like this conversation, make sure you guys follow the podcast on Apple and Spotify. Make sure you guys subscribe on YouTube. And if you know of any guest who would be a good fit for our podcast, please send me a message. And most importantly, I hope that you take something out of this podcast to put into perspective in your life and maybe help guide you through the journeys that you're facing right now. So thank you.